January 3rd, 1945, Brussels, Belgium, 11:47 p.m. A British field marshal picked up a pen and signed a document that would nearly destroy the most powerful military alliance in human history. He wasn't dropping bombs. He wasn't ordering a charge. He was firing a general, an American general. A general who had done absolutely nothing wrong. And somewhere in Versailles, in a limestone building that once housed French royalty, a Supreme Commander was about to read that document and feel something he almost never felt: rage. Because in 72 hours, Dwight Eisenhower would be forced to make a decision that could fracture the Western Alliance at the exact moment Germany was finally bleeding out. One wrong move, and 500,000 American soldiers would wake up to find their command structure in flames. Not from German artillery, from British arrogance. This is the story of a crisis nobody talks about. A confrontation that happened behind closed doors while the world watched the Battle of the Bulge. A moment where one man's ego nearly handed Adolf Hitler the thing he needed most in January 1945. Time. And at the center of it all was a quiet Texan named William Hood Simpson. Not a hero of legend, not a general with a nickname plastered across the newspapers, just a tall, bald, 54-year-old professional soldier who made one unforgivable mistake. He asked questions. That's it. That was his crime. He asked questions during a planning meeting, and for that, a British field marshal tried to end his career. But here is what that field marshal did not understand. He was not dealing with a politician. He was not dealing with a man who could be moved by rank or intimidated by reputation. He was dealing with Dwight Eisenhower, the man who had held this alliance together with bare hands since the beaches of Normandy. The man who had learned, through 6 months of brutal coalition warfare, exactly how much pressure a partnership between proud nations could take before it shattered. And on the morning of January 4th, 1945, Eisenhower was about to find out if he had learned enough. To understand how we got here, you need to go back 6 weeks. December 16th, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium and Luxembourg. 5:30 in the morning. The ground was frozen. The trees were white with snow. And then the sky caught fire. 2,000 German artillery pieces opened up simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The noise was so loud that soldiers 30 miles away thought an ammunition depot had exploded. The shells came in so fast and so thick that whole battalions lost communication within minutes. Then, out of the fog and the darkness, came the tanks. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last gamble. 250,000 German soldiers pouring through the weakest point of the American line with one objective: reach the port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in half, and force a negotiated peace before the Americans could bring their full industrial weight to bear. In the first 48 hours, it almost worked. American units were shattered, captured, or simply disappeared into the winter chaos. The Germans punched a bulge 70 miles deep into the Allied front. The situation was so catastrophic that Eisenhower did something that would have been politically unthinkable just 1 month earlier. He split the American front and handed the northern half to a British field marshal. His name was Bernard Montgomery. 57 years old, meticulous, theatrical, brilliant in set-piece battles, and possessed of an ego so enormous it had its own gravitational field. Montgomery had commanded British forces since El Alamein in 1942. He was a hero in Britain, the way Eisenhower was a hero in America. Careful, methodical, never attacked until he was certain of success. Eisenhower had always found him difficult, but in the chaos of December 1944, difficult was acceptable. Eisenhower needed someone to stabilize the northern shoulder while Bradley fought the southern fire. Montgomery was close. Montgomery was experienced. Montgomery got the job. Under his new command went two American armies. The First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the Ninth Army under General William Hood Simpson. 520,000 American soldiers, reporting to a Briton. Simpson had commanded the Ninth Army since September 1944. He had built it from scratch, trained it, shaped it into one of the most effective fighting forces in Europe. His men called him Big Simp, not with mockery, but with the kind of affection that soldiers reserve for commanders who actually know what they are doing. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall, completely bald, and spoke with the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who had grown up in Weatherford, Texas, and never saw any reason to pretend otherwise. He was also, by every measurable standard, excellent at his job. During the Bulge, Ninth Army held its sector with disciplined professionalism. When the line to his south began to buckle, Simpson shifted reserves without being asked. When German armor probed his flank, he responded faster than Montgomery's staff had anticipated. Bradley had watched Simpson operate for months and trusted him completely. Patton had watched Simpson and said the man was one of the 3 best Army commanders in the theater. None of this mattered to Montgomery. What Montgomery saw when he looked at William Simpson was not a professional. What he saw was an inconvenience with stars on his collar. Montgomery's command style had been developed over decades of leading British forces, where the culture of command ran straight down from the top, and questions from subordinates were, if not exactly forbidden, certainly not encouraged. Montgomery decided the battle plan. Montgomery approved the concept. Montgomery's staff worked out the details. Everyone else executed. That was the system. That was the only system Montgomery knew. And for the first few weeks, Simpson adapted. He followed orders. He executed the missions assigned to him. He was cooperative, professional, and unfailingly polite. Even when he disagreed with Montgomery's decisions, he worked within the chain of command. He was, in every respect, doing exactly what an Army commander was supposed to do. Then came January 2nd, 1945. The Bulge was essentially over. German forces were retreating. The crisis that had given Montgomery his American armies was fading, and Montgomery, instead of preparing to hand those armies back, was doing something else entirely. He was planning to keep them. His idea was a massive northern thrust into Germany. British and Canadian forces would strike across the Rhine River into the industrial heart of the Ruhr and drive straight toward Berlin. It was an ambitious plan, the kind of sweeping offensive that could theoretically end the war in a matter of weeks. But British and Canadian forces alone were not strong enough to execute it. Montgomery needed the Ninth Army, 300,000 Americans with full equipment, high morale, and a commander who had proven himself capable in every engagement since September. Montgomery called a planning conference at his headquarters outside Brussels. Simpson drove up from the Ninth Army command post with his senior staff officers. They walked into a briefing room where Montgomery's people had prepared an elaborate presentation. Maps, overlays, timelines, artillery schedules, engineering requirements for bridge construction under fire, airborne divisions, their drop zones already marked. It was a masterwork of operational planning, detailed and comprehensive, and very, very Montgomery. When the presentation finished, Montgomery asked for questions. Simpson had 3. The first was about timing. Montgomery's plan called for the Rhine crossing to begin in late March, nearly 3 months away. But German forces were actively retreating. Every day of delay gave them time to reinforce the far bank, repair destroyed units, move reserves. Why wait? Speed had always been the Western Allied advantage over German defensive preparation. Strike before they dig in. The second was about the artillery preparation. Montgomery was planning a bombardment so massive it would be visible from space. But that same bombardment would tell the Germans exactly where the crossing would occur, days in advance. Would surprise not be more valuable than firepower? The third was about coordination with American forces in the South. Patton's Third Army was already pushing toward the Rhine in a completely different sector. If Patton crossed first, German reserves would be pulled south. Montgomery's crossing in the north would face fewer defenders. Was there value in coordinating the timing? These were not radical questions. They were not challenges to Montgomery's authority. They were exactly the kind of professional input that American military culture expected from senior commanders. In the American system, an army commander who attended a planning conference and said nothing, questioned nothing, and simply nodded along was not being cooperative. He was being negligent. Montgomery's response was a single degree below freezing. He told Simpson that he was not interested in American opinions on operational timing. The plan had been approved. The Ninth Army would execute it as directed. Simpson nodded. "Of course, sir. I just wanted to ensure we had considered all the factors." "The factors," Montgomery said, "had been considered by him." The meeting continued. Simpson said nothing more. His chief of staff, who was sitting 2 chairs away, later told colleagues that he had watched Simpson's face during Montgomery's response and seen absolutely nothing. No anger, no embarrassment, no resentment. Just the calm professional blankness of a man who had decided that this particular hill was not worth dying on. But Montgomery was not finished. After Simpson's delegation left, Montgomery spoke with his own staff. He said Simpson was difficult. He said Simpson questioned orders too much. He said Simpson was not the type of American general he needed for the Rhine crossing. What Montgomery wanted, though he would never say it this plainly, was a general who would sit quietly, nod at the appropriate moments, and execute the plan without making him feel like his authority was being challenged. He wanted, in other words, a subordinate, not a professional. On January 3rd, Montgomery drafted the message. It was formally worded, the way all military correspondence is formally worded, but the content was unmistakable. Major General William Simpson was unsuitable for command under British operational control. His methods were incompatible with Montgomery's operational requirements. He should be replaced with a more cooperative American general. Montgomery signed it. His aides sealed it. A courier drove it through the frozen Belgian night toward Versailles. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, was known among the SHA staff as the most even-tempered man in the building. He had managed crises, smoothed over diplomatic disasters, absorbed the shock of bad news with the practiced calm of a man who had been doing it for 3 years. When he walked into Eisenhower's office on the morning of January 4th, carrying Montgomery's message, Smith was already braced for the reaction. He handed it over and watched. Eisenhower read it once. Then he read it again. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the paper harder than necessary. And then Walter Bedell Smith, who had worked alongside Eisenhower since before Torch, who had seen this man absorb the news of Kasserine Pass and the near collapse at the Bulge, and the political disasters of a dozen coalition crises, heard something he had almost never heard. Eisenhower swore. Not loudly, not theatrically, just a single, quiet, utterly sincere expression of anger from a man who almost never expressed anger. Because Eisenhower saw immediately what Montgomery's message actually was beneath the formal language. It was not a personnel request. It was not a professional assessment. It was a British field marshal, attempting to establish, as a matter of precedent, that he had the authority to remove American generals from command for the crime of doing their jobs professionally. And if Eisenhower allowed that precedent to stand, even once, even quietly, the consequences would cascade through every American command in Europe. Every American general serving under British operational control would learn the lesson within days. Ask questions, get fired. Disagree with a British assessment, get fired. Treat a British commander like a professional colleague rather than an unchallengeable sovereign, get fired. Within weeks, the American commanders serving under British control would stop thinking and start performing. They would become yes men, telling Montgomery and every other British commander exactly what they wanted to hear. Because honest assessments were career-ending, and battles fought on dishonest assessments were battles lost. Eisenhower picked up the phone and called Omar Bradley. "Brad," he said, "we have a problem." Bradley listened for 60 seconds. His response was immediate and volcanic and entirely unambiguous. "Absolutely not. Montgomery is not firing one of my generals." Bradley told Eisenhower what he already knew. Simpson was among the best 3 Army commanders in the European theater. His performance during the Bulge had been textbook. His soldiers were well-trained, well-supplied, and well-led. The only thing William Simpson had done wrong was treat Bernard Montgomery like a fellow professional instead of like a deity. "If Monty wants a servant," Bradley said, "he can hire one on his own budget. But he is not turning American generals into British subordinates." Bradley made one more thing clear. If Eisenhower removed Simpson to satisfy this demand, Bradley would consider it a declaration of no confidence in every American commander on the continent. The American command structure would not accept it quietly. Eisenhower hung up and sat alone with the problem. He could not fire Simpson. The backlash would be immediate and justified and catastrophic. But he also could not simply refuse Montgomery without offering something, because Montgomery was currently commanding 2 American armies, and if he felt he could not work with one of his army commanders, the situation would become operationally unworkable. And if Montgomery appealed to Churchill, which he absolutely would, the confrontation would escape the military world entirely and become a political crisis between Washington and London at the worst possible moment. Nobody won a confrontation like that. Everyone just lost differently. Eisenhower needed a solution that gave Montgomery enough to back down from, without giving him the thing he was actually asking for. He needed to defend the principle while preserving the alliance. He needed to tell a field marshal no, in a way that the field marshal could eventually accept without total humiliation. He picked up the phone again. This time he called Montgomery directly. Montgomery answered, expecting to discuss the logistics of Simpson's replacement. He had not yet understood what kind of conversation was actually coming. Eisenhower's first words were not an argument. They were a question. "Monty," he said, "what specifically has General Simpson done wrong?" And in Montgomery's headquarters outside Brussels, a British field marshal who had spent his entire career commanding men who never questioned him, who had built a legend on the foundation of meticulous planning and absolute authority, found himself unable to answer. Because Simpson had not done anything wrong. And somewhere in the pause before Montgomery began to speak, the next 72 hours of the Western Alliance hung in the balance. But what happened next would shock everyone in that headquarters, including Montgomery's own chief of staff. Because the crisis was only beginning. And before it was over, Eisenhower would deliver an ultimatum that gave Montgomery 1 hour to choose between his pride and his command. The clock was already running. 53 hours ago, Bernard Montgomery signed a document demanding the removal of General William Simpson. Eisenhower refused. He called Montgomery directly and asked one question that stopped the field marshal cold. What, specifically, had Simpson done wrong? Montgomery had no operational answer. No failed missions, no battlefield disasters. Only personal friction. Only wounded pride. And now Eisenhower was waiting on the line for a response that Montgomery could not give without admitting the truth about what he had actually done. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Montgomery began to speak, and what he said would force Eisenhower into the most dangerous gamble of his command. Montgomery told Eisenhower that this was not about operational failures. It was about compatibility. It was about command culture. It was about having a subordinate who understood the requirements of operating within a British-led headquarters. Simpson asked too many questions. He offered unsolicited opinions during planning conferences. He treated operational decisions as open for discussion when they were not. Montgomery needed American forces who would function as part of his machine, not as independent commentators on it. Eisenhower listened without interrupting. He was not surprised by the argument. He had expected it. What he was doing while Montgomery spoke was something Montgomery would not have recognized, because it was not a military calculation at all. It was a political one. He was measuring the exact weight of what he could offer without giving away what he could not surrender. When Montgomery finished, Eisenhower spoke. "Monty, I am not going to remove an American general because he asks questions during planning meetings. That is how American commanders operate. If you want American armies, you accept American command culture. That is not negotiable." Montgomery started to protest. Eisenhower continued without pausing. "However, I recognize that command relationships need to function. So here is what I am prepared to do." What Eisenhower offered was a surgical compromise. First Army, Courtney Hodges' 300,000 soldiers, currently under Montgomery's Northern Command, would return to Bradley's 12th Army Group immediately. Montgomery could keep the 9th Army. He could keep Simpson. He could execute his Rhine crossing operation with American strength intact. But after the Rhine was crossed, the 9th Army returned to American command. No extensions. No operational exceptions. No further discussion. "You can keep 9th Army for the Rhine crossing," Eisenhower said. "Or you can lose both armies right now. You have 1 hour." Then Eisenhower hung up. In Montgomery's headquarters outside Brussels, Major General Francis de Guingamp, Montgomery's chief of staff, had been standing 3 feet away during the entire call. He was one of the few men in the Allied command who genuinely understood both Montgomery and Eisenhower, who had spent years navigating the gap between them. And what he saw in Montgomery's face when the line went dead was not anger. It was shock. Montgomery turned to de Guingamp and explained the ultimatum in clipped, furious sentences. "Give up 1st Army now. Keep 9th Army for 1 operation. Accept or lose everything." He called it an outrage. He called it political interference in operational matters. He said Eisenhower was prioritizing American sensitivities over military effectiveness at the exact moment the Western Alliance needed clarity of command. De Guingamp waited for Montgomery to finish. Then he said the thing that only he could have said to Bernard Montgomery and survived the conversation. "Sir, you have to accept." Montgomery stared at him. De Guingamp pressed forward before the silence could harden into refusal. He laid out the arithmetic with the bluntness of a man who had nothing left to lose in this particular argument. Britain was the junior partner. American industry was producing more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition, more aircraft than the entire British Empire combined. American divisions outnumbered British divisions on the continent by a factor that grew larger every month. If Montgomery forced Churchill to choose between supporting a field marshal's personnel preferences and maintaining the American alliance, Churchill would not choose the field marshal. Churchill could not choose the field marshal. The political cost was too high, and the military reality too clear. "You tried to fire an American general?" de Guingamp said carefully. "Because he asks questions during planning meetings? How do you think that looks to every American commander in Europe right now?" Montgomery said it looked like a matter of operational authority. "It looks," de Guingamp said, "like exactly what it is. And if you reject this offer, you will spend the rest of the war commanding British and Canadian forces only, while Bradley and Patton drive to Berlin and collect the victory you planned." The room was very quiet. Montgomery stood at the window for a long moment. The Belgian winter outside was gray and still. Somewhere to the east, German forces were retreating through the same forest they had charged through 5 weeks earlier, leaving behind burned-out tanks and frozen dead in the snow. The war was tilting. The moment for a decisive northern thrust was real. And Montgomery knew, with the cold precision that made him genuinely brilliant as a planner, that the Ninth Army was the difference between a thrust that could end the war and a thrust that could only threaten it. He picked up the phone. 37 minutes had passed since Eisenhower's ultimatum. 3 minutes remained on the clock. Montgomery accepted. The terms were exactly as stated. First Army returned to Bradley effective immediately. Ninth Army remained under Montgomery's operational control for the Rhine crossing. Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. After the crossing succeeded, Ninth Army transferred back to American command without appeal. When Eisenhower hung up and Bedell Smith asked whether he believed Montgomery would actually honor the transfer after the operation, Eisenhower's answer was immediate. "He'll try to keep it," Eisenhower said. "He'll find operational reasons why the transfer would be disruptive. But I'll be ready for that." He sent orders to Bradley the same afternoon. First Army was returning to 12th Army Group. Bradley was satisfied with that part of the outcome. He got his largest army back. But he was not entirely satisfied, and he told Eisenhower so directly. Montgomery was going to use the Rhine crossing to build the argument for extended command. Every week Ninth Army spent under British control was another week of operational dependency that Montgomery could exploit as justification. "Let him try," Eisenhower said. Then he sent a separate message to William Simpson. The message was formal and carefully worded in the way that all sensitive military communications were carefully worded. But the meaning beneath the language was unmistakable to anyone who understood the context. "You did nothing wrong. A British field marshal attempted to end your career for being a professional. I said no. Continue your mission." Simpson's response was 3 sentences. He thanked Eisenhower for his confidence. He confirmed that Ninth Army would work professionally with Montgomery's headquarters throughout the Rhine crossing operation. He said he looked forward to returning to American command when the operation concluded. No anger, no complaint, no drama. Just a man doing his job. Bradley read Simpson's response when it crossed his desk and said nothing for a moment. Then he told his aide that Simpson was the only general in Europe who could get almost fired by a British field marshal and respond with a thank you note that sounded like a quarterly report. The official announcement went out on January 5, 1945. First Army had returned to American command. Ninth Army would remain under Montgomery's operational control for the Rhine crossing. The press reported it as a routine adjustment. They had no access to the 72 hours that had preceded it. They did not know about the message, the phone calls, the ultimatum, or the 37-minute standoff in a Belgian headquarters, while a field marshal stared out a winter window and calculated the price of his pride. But every senior commander in the European theater understood exactly what had happened. Montgomery had attempted to fire an American general. Eisenhower had refused. Montgomery had backed down. The precedent was now established at the highest level of Allied command. British officers did not have authority to remove American generals for professional disagreements. Questions during planning meetings were not insubordination. Honest assessments were not challenges to authority. The next 10 weeks were professionally tense in the specific way that occurs when two command cultures are forced to share operational space without genuinely respecting each other's methods. Montgomery's headquarters and Ninth Army's headquarters communicated with the precise, slightly over-formal courtesy of two offices whose occupants had nearly gone to war with each other over paperwork. Simpson followed orders. He executed every mission assigned to him. He appeared at every planning conference Montgomery convened and sat through every briefing with the attentive, non-committal expression of a man who had learned, at significant personal cost, exactly what kind of input was welcome in this particular room. He did not ask questions. He did not offer suggestions. He did not point out problems with operational assumptions. Montgomery's staff noticed the change immediately. Some of them, the ones who understood military professionalism well enough to recognize it, were uncomfortable with what they were seeing. A general who asked no questions and offered no assessments was not a cooperative subordinate. He was a liability. He was a man performing deference instead of leadership, and on a battlefield, the difference between those two things was measured in lives. But Montgomery did not notice, or did not care, or could not tell the difference. He had the American army he wanted, quiet and executing, and the Rhine crossing was coming together according to his plan. Then, on March 22, 1945, something happened that Montgomery had not planned for and could not control. George Patton reached the Rhine near Oppenheim. Patton's Third Army had been pushing east for weeks with the grinding, relentless aggression that was Patton's signature and his gift. He found a weakly defended sector near Oppenheim at 2200 hours on March 22nd. He did not call for an artillery preparation. He did not request an airborne division. He did not convene a planning conference or brief his staff on the operational requirements of a river crossing in detail. He looked at the river, looked at his available boats, and crossed. By dawn on March 23rd, 5 divisions of the Third Army were on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Patton called Bradley from a field telephone and gave him specific instructions. He wanted the crossing announced publicly before Montgomery's operation launched. He wanted the world to know that Third Army had crossed the Rhine without the elaborate machinery Montgomery had been assembling for months. He wanted the lesson to be unmistakable. "Tell them we're across," Patton said. "Tell them right now." Operation Plunder launched the following night, March 23rd, with 300,000 Allied troops, 2 airborne divisions dropping behind German lines, and an artillery preparation so massive it rattled windows in cities 40 miles from the river. It was a professional, well-executed, overwhelming demonstration of set-piece operational planning. Montgomery's crossing succeeded completely. By March 25th, a substantial bridgehead existed on the eastern bank, and German resistance in the north was fracturing. But Patton was already 30 miles beyond the river. American newspapers pointed out the sequence with barely concealed satisfaction. British newspapers emphasized the scale of Operation Plunder. The subtext of both was the same argument, made from opposite directions, about 2 fundamentally different approaches to warfare, and which one had crossed the Rhine first. Montgomery, true to Eisenhower's prediction, submitted plans for advancing into northern Germany that included Ninth Army as an integrated component of his force structure. His staff's language was carefully operational rather than political, citing coordination requirements and logistical dependencies, but the intent was identical to what Eisenhower had anticipated in January. He was trying to keep the army. On April 4, 1945, Eisenhower issued the order. Ninth Army returns to Bradley's 12th Army Group, effective immediately. No extensions. Montgomery appealed to Churchill. Churchill did not intervene. The political cost was exactly what de Guengan had calculated in that Brussels headquarters on the night of January 3rd, standing 3 feet from a field marshal who did not want to hear the truth. Too high. The American alliance was not negotiable for a personnel preference, and British influence over Allied strategy, which had been declining since the summer of 1944, could not survive another confrontation over the same ground. Simpson's Ninth Army linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe River in late April 1945. They did it under American command. But what happened between April 4th and the Elbe was not simply a military advance. It was the final proof of something Eisenhower had understood and Montgomery never fully grasped: that the quality which made Simpson difficult to command was the same quality that made him dangerous to the enemy. He thought. He adapted. He led men who trusted him because he trusted them. And units led that way moved faster and hit harder than units that only executed orders from above. The Germans had spent 5 months learning to fear the Ninth Army. Now, in the last weeks of the war, with no Rhine to defend and no prepared line to hold, they were about to find out what that army could do when it was finally unleashed without Montgomery's careful, methodical hand on the throttle. And somewhere in Germany, in a collapsing command structure that was burning its own documents and arguing over unconditional surrender, a question was forming in the minds of the men who had watched American forces fight for the past 11 months. Why did they always move so fast? The answer was not equipment. It was not numbers. It was something in how they were led, something in the relationship between the commanders and the men below them, something that allowed a general to ask a question during a planning meeting without ending his career, and allowed an army to cross a river without 6 weeks of preparation. That quality did not have a name in Montgomery's headquarters. It did not appear in his operational manuals, but in the spring of 1945, it was winning the war. And William Hood Simpson, the quiet Texan who had survived a British field marshal's attempt to destroy him for the crime of professional competence, was about to demonstrate exactly what it looked like at full speed. Montgomery had backed down. Eisenhower had held the line. Simpson had kept his command. First Army was back with Bradley. Ninth Army was preparing for the Rhine crossing under Montgomery's operational control, with a firm return date written into the orders. The crisis appeared resolved. The alliance appeared intact. And on the surface, in the official announcements and the press briefings and the polite correspondence between headquarters, everything looked exactly like a routine command adjustment. But in the Wehrmacht's high command, something had been noticed. Not the personnel dispute, not the 72-hour standoff between Versailles and Brussels. What German intelligence had noticed in the weeks between January and March of 1945 was something more operationally significant than any diplomatic crisis. They had noticed how Ninth Army moved. By February 1945, German Army Group B had compiled 3 separate intelligence assessments of American forces operating on the Northern Front. All 3 reached the same conclusion. Ninth Army, under Simpson, was advancing at a rate that defied the standard German calculations for American operational tempo. Where German planners expected 2 days of preparation before a significant push, Simpson's units were moving in hours. where German doctrine assumed that American forces would pause to consolidate after crossing a defended line. Ninth Army was already probing the next position before the first one was fully secured. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, read the assessments and told his staff that the Americans in the north were behaving differently from the Americans they had been fighting since Normandy. More aggressive, less predictable, harder to fix in place long enough to counterattack. His staff attributed it to supply advantages, to fresh equipment, to numerical superiority. Model was not satisfied with those answers. Supply advantages did not explain tactical tempo. Numbers did not explain the specific quality of decision-making at the brigade and division level, where Ninth Army's subordinate commanders were routinely acting on initiative without waiting for orders from above. That was not a logistics problem. That was a command culture. German losses in the Ninth Army sector between January 15th and March 1st, 1945, ran to approximately 27,000 prisoners and an estimated 18,000 killed or wounded, against American casualties roughly one-third of that figure. The ratio was not unusual for early 1945, when German forces were stretched beyond their capacity to replace losses. What was unusual was the geographic pace of the American advance. Ninth Army was covering ground at nearly twice the rate of adjacent Allied forces, and it was doing it without the massive artillery preparations and methodical consolidation phases that characterized Montgomery's own units on the same front. Model issued orders to his corps commanders in late February. Stop trying to hold fixed lines against Ninth Army. Delay, attrit. Force them to outrun their supply lines. Make them slow down. It was the right tactical instinct, and it came too late. Then, on March 7, 1945, something happened that had nothing to do with Simpson or Montgomery, or the command crisis that had nearly fractured the alliance 2 months earlier. American forces from First Army, now back under Bradley's command, seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before the Germans could destroy it. For the first time in the war, Allied forces had a bridge across the Rhine. Bradley threw 9 divisions across it within a week. The news hit German headquarters like a physical blow. Model received the report at 1600 hours on March 7th and immediately understood that the strategic situation, which had been deteriorating for months, had just collapsed. A bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine meant the river barrier was gone. The last natural defensive line between the Allied armies and the German interior was now a crossing point. Every available reserve would have to go to Remagen, which meant the northern front, where Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder was still 2 weeks from launch, would be stripped of the reserves that had been earmarked to contest a Rhine crossing in that sector. Simpson was briefed on the Remagen crossing the same evening. He read the intelligence summary once and called his chief of staff. He said one sentence: "They just made our job easier." His chief of staff asked, "How much easier?" Simpson thought for a moment. "Significantly," he said. He was correct. But the full meaning of significantly would not become clear until the week of April 1st through April 8th, 1945, in the industrial valleys east of the Rhine River, during an operation that would later be described by German survivors as the moment they understood the war was over. Operation Plunder launched on the night of March 23rd as planned. 300,000 Allied troops, 2 airborne divisions, an artillery preparation that lasted 4 hours and consumed more shells than the entire British Army had fired in the first 2 years of the war. Montgomery's crossing was professional, overwhelming, and successful. By March 25th, the bridgehead was 10 miles deep and expanding. Simpson's Ninth Army crossed as part of the operation. They crossed on schedule, in their assigned sector, without drama. Then they drove east. By March 28th, Ninth Army's lead elements were 40 miles from the Rhine. By March 30th, they were 60 miles east, moving through the disintegrating German rear with a speed that was leaving even Bradley's staff struggling to track their positions accurately. German units that were supposed to be holding blocking positions were found already bypassed, their flanks turned before they had completed their defensive preparations. April 1st, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket. American forces from Ninth Army in the north and First Army in the south completed a double envelopment of German Army Group B near the city of Paderborn. The encirclement closed around 325,000 German soldiers, the largest encirclement of German forces on the Western Front in the entire war. Field Marshal Model was inside the pocket. The scale of what had happened took 24 hours to fully register in Bradley's headquarters. His staff ran the numbers 3 times because the first 2 results seemed impossible. 325,000 soldiers, 18 divisions, the entire operational reserve that Germany had counted on to defend the approaches to Berlin from the west. Gone. In 9 days. Simpson's Ninth Army had contributed the northern jaw of the encirclement, driving 150 miles in 12 days through terrain that German doctrine considered inherently defensible. The average daily advance rate was 12.5 miles, against an enemy that was fighting, not retreating, against units with anti-tank weapons and artillery and prepared positions, against defenders who understood that every mile they gave up brought the war 1 mile closer to ending in German defeat. 12.5 miles per day. Inside the pocket, the situation for Army Group B was immediately catastrophic. Model had 325,000 men and supplies for approximately 3 weeks of intensive combat. He had no air support. He had no prospect of relief. He had been told by Berlin to hold the Ruhr industrial region as a fortress. The same instruction that had been given to commanders at Stalingrad and Falaise and every other German encirclement of the last 3 years. And he understood exactly what that instruction meant. He began issuing orders that he knew would not save his army. He reorganized his perimeter. He distributed ammunition. He established a command structure for a defense that had no realistic endpoint. And then, on April 15, 1945, he dismissed his staff, drove into the forest near Duisburg, and shot himself. Before he died, he left a note. It said that a German field marshal did not surrender. 317,000 German soldiers did not share that conviction. They began surrendering on April 14th and continued for 4 days. The processing capacity of American prisoner of war collection points was completely overwhelmed. Units that had been equipped to handle 5,000 prisoners found themselves managing 30,000. Simpson's logistics staff improvised holding areas in fields and sports stadiums and factory yards. German soldiers walked in organized columns, stacked their weapons, and sat down in the spring grass to wait. The war in the West was not officially over. It would not be officially over for another 3 weeks. But for the men who fought it, the Ruhr Pocket was the moment it became certain. Not possible, not probable, certain. American combat deaths in the Western European theater dropped by 60% in the 2 weeks following the encirclement. German forces east of the Ruhr, stripped of their operational reserve and deprived of any realistic prospect of stopping the Allied advance, began surrendering in battalion-sized groups rather than fighting to the last position. The infrastructure of German resistance, which had been bending since the Bulge and cracking since Remagen, simply stopped functioning. Eisenhower received the final casualty estimates for the Ruhr encirclement on April 18th. He read them at his desk in Versailles, in the same office where he had read Montgomery's demand to fire Simpson 3.5 months earlier. The numbers were almost beyond military historical precedent for the Western Front. 317,000 prisoners. An estimated 67,000 killed or wounded during the encirclement fighting. 18 divisions effectively destroyed as combat formations. He sent a short message to Bradley. "Well done." He sent a longer message to Simpson. It acknowledged Ninth Army's contribution to the encirclement, with the specific, detailed praise that Simpson's understated performance had always earned and rarely received publicly. Eisenhower cited the operational tempo, the initiative of Ninth Army's subordinate commanders, the logistical achievement of sustaining a force moving at that speed over that distance. He used the word exemplary twice. There was no mention of January. There was no reference to the message from Brussels, the phone calls, the ultimatum, the 37 minutes. The official record of William Hood Simpson contained no trace of the moment a British field marshal had tried to end his career. But every senior American commander in Europe knew the history. They knew what had almost happened and what Eisenhower had done to prevent it. And in the aftermath of the Ruhr Pocket, with 317,000 prisoners being processed through impromptu collection points across Western Germany, the lesson was visible in the numbers. Simpson was still in command because Eisenhower had refused to fire him for asking questions. Ninth Army had driven the northern jaw of the encirclement because Simpson led the way Americans led, with subordinates who thought and acted and adapted rather than waited for permission. The encirclement had succeeded in 9 days because of command culture, because of the specific quality of military leadership that Montgomery had found irritating and tried to remove, and Eisenhower had understood was irreplaceable. 317,000 prisoners. That was the answer to Montgomery's January message, written in the only language that military history accepts as definitive. The Ninth Army continued east after the Ruhr Pocket closed. They crossed the Weser River on April 9th. They took Hanover on April 10th. They reached the Elbe River on April 11th, 1945, becoming the first Allied force to reach that river. Simpson stood on the western bank and looked east across the water toward Soviet forces advancing from the opposite direction, and understood that the geography of the war had reduced itself to this: a river. 2 armies approaching from opposite ends of a continent, and between them, a Germany that no longer had the capacity to stop either one. He requested permission from Bradley to cross the Elbe and continue to Berlin. Bradley relayed the request to Eisenhower. Eisenhower said no. The political agreements with the Soviet Union established the Elbe as the boundary. American forces would hold the western bank and wait for link-up with Soviet forces. Simpson acknowledged the order without protest. He positioned his divisions along the western bank of the Elbe and began the administrative work of an army that had run out of war to fight. He processed prisoners. He organized civil affairs teams. He wrote reports. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet soldiers made first contact across the Elbe at Torgau. The ceremony was photographed and broadcast around the world. Smiling soldiers from 2 armies that had fought toward each other from opposite ends of Europe for 4 years, shaking hands over the water that now marked the boundary between their advancing fronts. Ninth Army was there, the army that a British field marshal had tried to eliminate in January. The army that Eisenhower had protected at the cost of a 72-hour command crisis that nearly fractured the Western Alliance. The army that had driven 150 miles in 12 days to close the Ruhr Pocket around 325,000 German soldiers. At the Elbe, right where the map said they should be. But what happened to the man who led them there, and what the men who served under him understood about why they had won, and what the history books recorded and failed to record about those 72 hours in January. That was a story that still had one chapter left. A chapter about what leadership actually costs. What it actually means when someone in authority decides that a professional doing his job correctly is worth protecting. And what that decision looks like 40 years later, when the war is over, and the generals are old, and the records are declassified. And the truth about what almost happened in January 1945 finally comes out. That story was quieter than the Ruhr Pocket. It had no artillery, and no encirclements, and no prisoners by the 100,000. But it was, in its own way, the most important part of the whole thing. And almost nobody knows it. 4 parts, 4 hours of history. This is how it ends. From a January morning in Versailles, when Eisenhower read a British Field Marshal's demand and swore quietly at his desk, to an April afternoon on the banks of the Elbe River, where Ninth Army soldiers shook hands with Soviet troops across the water that marked the end of Nazi Germany's ability to resist. From a 72-hour command crisis that nearly fractured the Western Alliance at its most critical moment, to 317,000 German prisoners processed in open fields, while their field marshal drove alone into a forest and made his final decision. The crisis is over. The battle is won. The war is ending. But the cliffhanger from Part 3 was never about artillery or encirclements. It was about something quieter. What happened to the man at the center of it all? What did history record, and what did it choose to forget? And what does a decision made in 72 hours by one man in one office in Versailles actually mean when you measure it against the full weight of what followed? Because this story has a final chapter, and it is not the chapter most people expect. William Hood Simpson returned to the United States in the autumn of 1945. He was 55 years old. He had commanded Ninth Army for 13 months, across some of the most significant ground combat in Western European history. His army had crossed the Rhine, driven 150 miles in 12 days, closed the northern jaw of the Ruhr encirclement, and reached the Elbe River as the first Allied force to arrive at that boundary. His soldiers had processed more prisoners in the final weeks of the war than any other American army in the theater. He came home to no ticker-tape parade, no magazine covers, no book deal with a major publisher. The American public in 1945 knew the names Patton and Bradley and Eisenhower with the familiarity of household words. They knew Montgomery's name, partly because Montgomery had spent considerable energy ensuring they would. They did not know Simpson's name in the same way. Simpson had never cultivated the press. He had never delivered theatrical speeches to his troops for the cameras. He had never worn an ostentatious uniform, or carried a distinctive weapon, or adopted the kind of personal mythology that war correspondents needed to build the narrative their audiences demanded. He was, in the language of the men who served under him, just genuinely good at his job. And in the economy of wartime fame, genuine competence without theatrical packaging was almost invisible. He received the Distinguished Service Medal. The citation praised his tactical skill, his operational judgment, and his professional character in terms that were accurate and thorough and completely without the drama that would have made them memorable to a general public that was already moving on to peacetime concerns. He was promoted to full general, 4 stars, in 1954. He retired from the Army the same year. In his retirement, Simpson gave occasional lectures at military colleges. He wrote carefully worded articles for professional military journals. He was unfailingly polite to the historians who contacted him, answered their questions with precision and without embellishment, and declined to sensationalize any aspect of his wartime service. When asked about the incident with Montgomery, he described it with the same flat, unhurried Texan calm he had brought to every planning conference in Brussels and every command decision in the Rhineland. He said he had learned that coalition warfare required cultural understanding of how different armies approached command relationships. He said Eisenhower had handled a difficult situation with characteristic skill. He said he bore no resentment toward Montgomery and considered him a gifted operational planner, despite their differences in command philosophy. He never said, "A British field marshal tried to fire me for doing my job, and Eisenhower told him no." He never said, "That decision, made in 72 hours in January 1945, was the reason 317,000 Germans were captured instead of fighting for another 3 months." He never said any of the things that would have made him famous. William Hood Simpson died on August 15, 1980. He was 90 years old. The New York Times published an obituary that correctly identified him as the commander of 9th Army during World War II and noted his distinguished service record. It did not mention the January 1945 command crisis. The full documentation of what Montgomery had attempted and what Eisenhower had refused would not become widely available to historians for another decade, when the relevant correspondence was fully declassified and researchers began assembling the complete picture of what had happened in those 72 hours. Montgomery outlived Simpson by 15 years. He died in 1976. His memoirs, published in 1958, described his command of American forces during and after the Bulge in terms that were characteristically self-congratulatory. He wrote that some American commanders had required more guidance than others during the Rhine crossing period. He never specified who he meant. He never acknowledged that he had attempted to have one of those commanders removed and been refused by the Supreme Commander. The historical record, however, is not obligated to share Montgomery's reticence. But Simpson's personal legacy, as meaningful as it is, was never the most important dimension of what those 72 hours produced. The most important dimension was the precedent, and the precedent outlasted everyone who set it. Eisenhower's decision to protect Simpson established something that shaped American military command culture through every conflict that followed. It established that professional competence was not negotiable in exchange for coalition harmony. It established that honest assessment from subordinate commanders was a military requirement, not a political inconvenience. It established that the standard for removing the commander was operational failure, not personal friction with a superior who preferred deference to information. These principles were not new in January 1945. They were embedded in American military tradition going back generations. What Eisenhower did was defend them under maximum pressure, at the moment when the temptation to sacrifice one man's career for a quieter alliance was strongest. And the cost of that defense was most immediately visible. The ripple effect was measurable in Korea, where American divisional commanders operating under United Nations command structures maintained the professional independence that allowed rapid tactical adaptation to an enemy whose methods differed fundamentally from anything encountered in Europe. It was measurable in the institutional culture that produced the officer corps of the 1960s and 1970s, who had learned from commanders who had served under Eisenhower and Simpson and Bradley that subordinate input was not insubordination. It was measurable in the doctrine reforms of the 1980s, which explicitly institutionalized the kind of mission command philosophy that Simpson had embodied and Montgomery had found intolerable. 40 nations subsequently adopted elements of the American mission command doctrine into their own military systems between 1950 and 2000. The core principle was always the same. Commanders at every level are expected to understand the intent of their superiors and act on that intent using their own judgment when circumstances change faster than orders can be issued. Questions are not challenges to authority. Honest assessments are professional obligations. The subordinate who tells you only what you want to hear is more dangerous than the enemy. Simpson never wrote that principle down as a doctrine. He just lived it, in every planning conference he attended, and every question he asked, and every professional response he gave to every attempt to make him into something smaller than what he was. That is a legacy that does not appear in obituaries, but it is real, and it is still operating. Now here is the detail that almost no one knows. The one that the declassified records revealed in 1992, when historians gained full access to the SHAEF correspondence files for the January 1945 period. Montgomery's message demanding Simpson's removal was not the only message he sent that day. On the same date, January 3, 1945, Montgomery sent a separate communication to his own government in London. It was addressed to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, who was Montgomery's primary advocate within the British military establishment and the man most responsible for protecting Montgomery's position against American criticism throughout the war. The message described the command's situation on the Northern Front, outlined Montgomery's operational requirements for the Rhine crossing, and made a specific argument for keeping both American armies, 1st and 9th, under his permanent command through the end of the war. It did not mention Simpson by name. It did not reference the demand to fire him. It framed the case entirely in operational terms. But its purpose was clear to anyone who read it, alongside the message to Eisenhower. Montgomery was not simply trying to remove one general. He was trying to establish permanent British command over 500,000 American soldiers for the final campaign of the war in Europe. The Simpson demand was the tactical opening move in a strategic campaign to reshape the Allied command structure before the war ended and the post-war power arrangements were fixed. Brooke received the message and did not act on it. He understood, better than Montgomery, how far the political ground had shifted beneath British feet since D-Day. He understood that Churchill would not support a confrontation with Washington over command arrangements that the Americans had already conceded too much to reach. He filed the message and waited to see what Eisenhower would do. When Eisenhower refused, when Montgomery backed down, when the compromise gave Montgomery one army for one operation and nothing more, Brooke wrote a single line in his diary. He wrote that Eisenhower had handled it well. That was the entire entry. One sentence. From the man who had argued with Eisenhower over strategy for 3 years, who had consistently underestimated American operational capability, who had backed Montgomery through every controversy and miscalculation of the European campaign. Eisenhower handled it well. The full meaning of those 4 words only becomes clear when you understand what Montgomery had actually been attempting. Not a personnel decision, a power structure. The Simpson crisis was the visible surface of something much larger, and Eisenhower had recognized it for what it was and responded to the larger thing, not just the surface. That is why the 72 hours matter, beyond the career of one Texas general and the wounded pride of one British field marshal. That is why this story is worth 90 minutes of your attention. From a quiet, bald-headed Army commander who asked 3 questions at a planning conference, to a decision that preserved the operational independence of every American general in Europe, to a precedent that shaped military command culture for the next half-century, to a secret parallel correspondence that revealed the full scope of what Eisenhower had actually stopped in January 1945. That is the complete arc, and the numbers at the end of it are not small. 520,000 American soldiers who remained under commanders who thought independently rather than performed obedience. 317,000 German prisoners taken in 12 days by an army led the way Simpson led it. 40 nations that eventually incorporated the command philosophy Simpson embodied into their own military doctrine. One war ended in May 1945, rather than extending into a summer that American planners had estimated would cost another 200,000 casualties on the Western Front alone. The historians who study coalition warfare will tell you that alliances are held together by shared interest and mutual respect in roughly equal measure. What Eisenhower understood, and what the January crisis demonstrated, is that mutual respect is not the same as deference. You can respect a colleague and still tell him no. You can value an alliance and still refuse to let it demand the professional destruction of a man who has done nothing wrong. That distinction between genuine respect and performed subordination, between coalition partnership and institutional surrender, is the thing that Eisenhower defended in those 72 hours. It cost him a diplomatic confrontation he would rather have avoided. It cost him 37 minutes of waiting by a telephone while a field marshal stared out a window and calculated his pride. What it produced was the Western Alliance intact for the final campaign. What it produced was Ninth Army, commanded by the right man, closing the right encirclement, reaching the right river at the right time. If there is a single story in the history of World War II that answers the question of why the Western Allied coalition succeeded where so many alliances in history had fractured under pressure, this is one of the strongest candidates. Not because of the drama of the confrontation, though the drama was real, but because of the principle that survived it. Professional competence is not negotiable. Honest assessment is not insubordination. And the commander who tells you what you need to hear instead of what you want to hear is the most valuable person in any room. William Simpson knew that. Eisenhower knew that. And for 72 hours in January 1945, the fate of the Western Alliance depended on whether the man at the top would act on what he knew when it was most costly to do so. He did, and 317,000 Germans laying down their weapons in the April grass of the Ruhr Valley is what that decision looked like when it was finished. If you know a story like this one, a moment where one decision by one person held something larger together than anyone watching from the outside could see, leave it in the comments. History is full of these moments. Most of them never made the front page. Subscribe if you want to find more of them, because this is only one story in a war that was full of them. And the ones nobody talks about are almost always the ones that matter most. The world was changed by men whose names you do not know. That is not a tragedy. That is the truth about how change actually happens. And William Hood Simpson, standing quietly on the western bank of the Elbe River in April 1945, watching Soviet soldiers wave from the opposite shore, knew it better than anyone.